Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for joining us. Well, it's Easter and Passover. The subjects for today, we're going to talk about kids, what they're about, how life has changed for them, and then we're going to get into the condition of Pennsylvania bridges and roads, given all the travel that's likely to take place this spring and summer in the state of Pennsylvania. Back after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, joining me, as often is the case, is Bob Latham. He's the Executive Vice President of the Associated Pennsylvania Constructors. He's one of the leading experts on Pennsylvania, the conditions on our roads and our bridges, and we're going to also talk about work safety zones. And did you get past this morning at somebody going about 100 miles an hour? That's not uncommon. We'll get into that with Bob as well. All right, give us an update. What are the conditions of Pennsylvania's roads and bridges as you and I chat?
Well, they're certainly improving, Terry. We're really encouraged by the work and the funding that we're seeing out of the Washington infrastructure package. We're able to attack a number of the conditions of our bridges and roads. We're going to be motorists are going to be seeing a lot of work this spring, and our conditions of pavements on our major roads are definitely improving. But what I will say is that on our what we call secondary roads, and you know the viewers can relate to that as your local roads, they're having problems. That's where our funding situation is lacking. Now, it's important to understand that Pennsylvania is structured different than some other states. So, for example, in Maryland, these local roads would be funded by the counties, by your county property taxes, by your Maryland income tax. They're funded in Pennsylvania by the gas tax and maintained by PennDOT. Right. Because we see a lot or hear a lot about, well, Pennsylvania has a relatively high gas tax. Well, that's true, but a lot of other states are funding some of these more local roads out of other funds, and it gets a little complicated. But the point is, to your question, is those local roads are struggling a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the funding.
I'll tell you, you can't drive almost anywhere and not see road construction ahead, and overall we're doing better, but there is still a lot more to do, isn't there?
Yes, and again, we talked about it many times, our geography, our geology. We have more bridges, we have more rivers, and we have more mountains than any other state in the country. So that means more infrastructure, and the fact that we're in this sort of freeze-thaw cycle that we've always been in is tough on concrete and tough on pavement and tough on steel. So we constantly have to be replacing and fixing our bridges and our roads.
Now, you mentioned earlier the federal monies, but how do the residents of Pennsylvania pay for bridge and road construction?
Well, we made a conscious effort, sort of a policy decision, that our registration fees are low compared to other states. You don't, Virginia, you pay an annual personal property tax on the value of your vehicle. Don't have that here in Pennsylvania. In Maryland, the sales tax on motor vehicles goes into transportation. In Pennsylvania, it goes into the general fund. So as a result, we made a conscious policy decision that motorists pay through the gas tax, and it's really a user fee, because think about it: if it costs very little to register your car or get a license, so the cost to enter the system is low in Pennsylvania, but the more you drive, the more fuel you consume, the higher amount of gas tax you pay. So it's really a based on your use, and that's how we fund. And a lot of that not only just goes to PennDOT roads, but it also there's a significant share that goes to municipalities. So your local township and borough streets and things like that get money out of the Pennsylvania gas tax.
Well, what about electric vehicles? What's the situation with them in terms of their participation?
The federal bill provides a lot of funding for build-out of charging stations for electric vehicles. But that's a conundrum also, because if you have a vehicle that is powered by diesel or or gasoline, you're paying that gas tax I just talked about. If you have a vehicle that's powered by electricity, you're not paying that gas tax. You're not paying that user fee. You only pay the license fee. So Pennsylvania's been kicking around a higher registration fee for owners of all electric vehicles that would be commensurate with the gas tax that are paid by people that own fuel cars. There's legislation that's been introduced by Senator Wayne Langerholk, Transportation Chair, that would impose a user fee on electric vehicles, a mileage-based fee. That's a unique idea. It's something that we need to be looking at going to in the future as we move towards more electric vehicles and away from gas consumption. But there's some policy issues that go with that as well.
All right, we're going to talk about work safety zones. It's hard to think of a subject more important if you're out on the road, and we'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, let's talk about speed enforcement programs. All right, Bob Latham, automated speed enforcement programs. First of all, what are they?
So we just talked about the construction program and whether we'll be looking at more projects. So we're not building new roads in Pennsylvania anymore. We're repairing the ones that we have, which means we have highway workers out there trying to do their job while under traffic and while people are driving by. So the message is slow down in those work zones and save lives. And the interesting thing about it is we're obviously concerned with our workers out there. We want them to come home. We want them to have a safe work environment. But most accidents in work zones involve motorists. In other words, most fatalities, most injuries are actually motorists because there are lane shifts and all that. It's a dangerous spot to be. You can't be going through those work zones at 70, 80, 90 miles an hour the way people are. So we've set up a system that will ticket people automatically. We have cameras set up in the work zones, and if you go through, if you're more than 11 miles over the speed limit, you're going to get a speeding fine. That is a sort of a pilot program. We hope to reauthorize it this year, add a little bit more teeth to it, and encourage people to slow down. This coming week is National Work Zone Safety Awareness Week, and we're going to be joining PennDOT and the Turnpike to call attention to the need for people to slow down. People need to slow down in general. Yeah. It's kind of crazy out there. We've talked about that, but the point is, we have about 600 or 700 projects going on every year. These are static projects, not some of these rolling maintenance things. And the maintenance crews are out there too, and it's dangerous for them. So the automated work zone speed enforcement, it's kind of a mouthful. Basically, it's cameras in the work zone that are going to electronically send you a ticket if you don't slow down.
This is a pilot program. What's going to happen with it?
Well, it needs to be approved, reauthorized by the Pennsylvania General Assembly. We're going to see legislation introduced very soon to do that. We're hoping to tweak some of the signage that needs to be part of that. We want to take away the grace period for the first offense. We want to be able to have more of these around the state as well.
All right. What is going on with the high rate of speed?
It's really disappointing to note. I mean, several years ago, we talked about in 2018, we had the lowest number of highway fatalities in Pennsylvania in the history of driving, if you will.
Wow.
And think about the difference in the number of cars today versus the 1930s or 40s. Well, that since the pandemic has gone back up, and it's really due to unsafe driving. I'm sure everybody that's watching this has their own experience. One of the things is when somebody flies by me, I always say, well, there's another one coming, and if for some reason it seems like they're racing or something like that. So
yeah.
it's not allowed. I mean, I jest, but it's a serious problem, and I know that law enforcement is trying to do stuff about it, and government's trying to get the word out. But
I noticed that many of them are young people. Is this something that needs to be emphasized over and over again in the schools?
Yeah, I think, and also maybe driver education.
Yeah,
we can talk to some of the companies that do driver education, because when you and I went to school, I think, at least I did, we had a driver's ed teacher in high school. You don't have that anymore. You got to go to a private operation or just learn it on your own. So that's probably something we can talk to schools about emphasizing.
Well, thank you. You'll come back and give us an update. All right, coming up, we're going to talk about kids. We were just talking about young people. We'll talk about kids after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by
Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, joining me now is Kari King. She's the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Partnership for Children. All right, Kari, I'll tell you, everything I read indicates that life for kids growing up is very different than it was in previous generations. The challenges they face, the tribulations, and that it just keeps going on and on and on. Well, what's different?
Yeah. No, thanks for having me, Terry. And absolutely, I think we were already on that trajectory, and the COVID-19 pandemic just accelerated it. Where kids were dealing with remote learning, parents were working from home, managing kids. So that sense of isolation during the lockdown. And I think we're still really trying to figure out what the long-term impacts are in terms of mental health, in terms of learning loss. So I think that trend that we were seeing before March of 2020, we've just seen that accelerate the past few years.
Well, what I also read about is the impact of social media. The fact that they communicate. I mean, I have an 11-year-old grandson who can teach me about using my iPhone and my iPad.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. I have an 8- and a 5-year-old, and they certainly know more than I do on an iPad. And it's just kind of common, it's standard in education, to have that technology, which is great. It's a gateway to more information. But I think you're right with social media, just the influence on kids. It's so important to focus on mental health. There have been a lot of discussions, how do we get to the solutions with what kids are facing today? And I think really on the preventive side around mental health, it needs to be a big conversation.
Yeah, I mean, does that mean that they're communicating less person to person and much more through social media, and also with people that they don't really know? Mm-hmm. They could be not just in their town, in their state, in their country, but all over the world.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it really kind of sets the stage for conversations with parents or caregivers with kids around boundaries, around safety, that I know when I was growing up many years ago were not part of the conversation. Yeah. So, we were. I know we'll talk more about the budget in a little bit, but I think it's commendable where, it really gets to the preventive side and focusing on mental health. And we're really pleased to see there's an additional $100 million in Governor Shapiro's proposed budget for mental health services for kids, which is really necessary.
Get into that in a few minutes. All right, let's talk about the differences in socioeconomic terms. Let's talk about money, first of all, and Medicaid. What role does Medicaid programs, obviously, for the poor play into all of this?
Yeah, no, we do a lot of policymaker education, and it's never ending where lawmakers are really surprised to hear how many kids receive their health insurance through Medicaid. There's a lot of stereotype stigma around Medicaid, but at the end of the day, it covers over 40% of kids in Pennsylvania.
I want you to repeat that.
Yeah, so over 40% of kids in Pennsylvania receive it's health insurance. That's what it is. It's giving them health insurance coverage. And that's access to things like primary care visits with pediatricians to make sure kids are getting immunized, make sure they're developing properly, dental care. So some really important core things, and we know that when kids are healthy, they're set up on a path for more success as adults. So we really just reinforce that we want every kid to be insured.
So basically what you're saying is that the health is another critical factor, and you often don't think about that for young people, but it's a critical factor in their education, in their socialization aspects?
Absolutely, yeah. The research has shown that if kids go to their well child visits, get their immunizations, are growing properly, they're going to be more successful later in life. And to kind of tie back to our conversation around mental health, that's another big piece of it too. That's a big component to make sure you're able to access mental health services. You have to be insured. So yeah, we always reinforce to policymakers that Medicaid is health insurance, and every kid deserves to have health insurance to grow into productive adults.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Governor Shapiro's budget recommendations and that deal with aspects of this as well.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, Kari King, before I go on and talk about what's in the governor's budget proposal, what does the Pennsylvania Partnership for Children actually do that's relevant to this subject?
Yeah. So we're the statewide advocacy group in Pennsylvania. We've been around since the early 1990s. And so what that means is we meet regularly with folks in the legislature, the executive branch, and really derive our public policies from data. We look at data and research to kind of tell us how our kids, where can they improve, where do we need to kind of see better outcomes. So we really cover topics from K-12 education to early education, children's health, child welfare, but it's really about changing public policy to benefit our state's children.
But in order to accomplish that, lawmakers and their staff have to understand the changes that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big one coming up right now that we're focusing on is on Medicaid and children's health insurance coverage. At the start of the pandemic 3 years ago, it's crazy to think that it's been 3 years. Children and all enrollees in Medicaid were allowed to stay enrolled continuously, so they weren't going to drop coverage. And really the federal government did that to make sure that during the economic crisis that happened as part of the pandemic, that folks still had health insurance. And during a public health emergency, that's a really key thing to make sure you have access to health care. That's ending, though. So as of April 1st, states, including Pennsylvania, can start to do what we call a redetermination process. So essentially see who can stay on Medicaid, who can keep that health insurance coverage. We want to make sure that kids don't unnecessarily lose it.
Let's talk about Governor Shapiro's budget recommendations. What aspects of it deal with the subject we're chatting about? Yeah,
no, absolutely. We're very closely watching the Medicaid piece. We realize the redetermination process is critical. It certainly has been an umbrella for families weathering the storm of the pandemic. But there is a fiscal impact to that. So also making sure that the Department of Human Services has resources to do this process. And really making sure, I want to stress to folks out there, if they're on Medicaid and not sure if they're going to remain eligible or not, go to the Department of Human Services website. It's dhs.pa.gov. And you can see there in terms of renewing your coverage. And again, we just want to make sure folks don't drop off. There's other options out there. If you're not eligible for Medicaid, there's the Children's Health Insurance Program. There's Penny, which is our health insurance marketplace. So again, there's really no reason in Pennsylvania that kids should not have health insurance. And so during this process, we just want to make sure that kids stay connected to that care.
And there's also the educational side of it. I mean, we understand how significant education is. Obviously, we can talk about K through 12 right now. You have an aspect of daycare that rolls into all of this. That all makes this far more complicated than we might realize.
Yeah. You know, we really kind of cover the continuum on the education side for kids. As you noted, on the early education side, one of the things that we always follow closely is pre-K education. So that's for 3- and 4-year-olds. Really making sure they're ready to go into kindergarten. And just like we talked about, where with health insurance, it set kids up for more productive adulthoods, it's the same thing that we see with pre-K. They're on that path to success as they go into the public school system and better set up for success as adults. So we were really pleased to see the governor proposed a $33 million increase for pre-K in the budget. And this is one of those areas where we see a lot of bipartisan support. So we'll continue to work on that.
I was going to push that. I mean, it would seem it shouldn't have a partisan aspect to it, given the significance of what we're chatting about.
Yeah, it's one of the few areas of the state budget over the past few years where typically, when we have a divided government between Republicans and Democrats and the governor and the legislature, they usually agree on pre-K, which is great. I think over the past few years, policymakers really understand the positive impacts of high quality pre-K. So we're really, really pleased to see that.
Yeah. So do you sit down and work with staffers and lawmakers to make sure they appreciate and fully comprehend the subject that we're talking about?
Yeah, we do that at the state and federal level. Most of our work is state focused, but yeah, it's really around that policymaker education with members and staff, really understanding, like we talked about before, where a lot of folks don't realize things like how many kids are on Medicaid, how many kids have access to pre-K. Another area we've really been focused on is career and technical education. When I grew up, that was referred to as VOTEC, but we now refer to that
it's growing.
Yes, absolutely, and it really kind of feeds into the economic competitiveness of the state. We need to make sure we're preparing the workforce, and that really can start in high school with career and technical education. So again, really pleased to see in the governor's budget there was over $14 million for CTE in the state budget.
And as you've interacted with lawmakers, the response to that aspect of it has been pretty positive?
Yeah, the interesting thing with education, sometimes there's a lot of support for things around pre-K, around career and technical education. When you look at basic education funding in the state budget, it is one of the larger line items. It's a large cost driver in our state budget, but I think it goes back to we need to invest in kids, and when you invest early, it pays off later.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming in. This is an extremely important subject, and this is a significant update. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, you stay well.